There are minds that do not simply see life as it happens, but take each moment apart as if it were a delicate watch, full of gears that must be understood before it can be trusted. Every glance, every tone of voice, every pause between words becomes a puzzle, and the world feels like a room full of hidden meanings waiting to be uncovered. Some people listen not just to what is said, but to what is avoided, to what slips through silence and hesitation. They sense the temperature of a conversation in the same way others notice the weather outside, as if the atmosphere itself carries clues about what lies beneath a person's mask. For them, nothing is ever just surface, and nothing is ever accidental, because life has taught them that answers live under the calmest waters. So they look closer, again and again, until looking becomes a habit and a quiet kind of survival. They try to protect themselves by understanding everything before it happens, hoping that knowledge can soften the unexpected. Stay with this thought for a moment, and let it move quietly beneath your own memories. Notice what happens inside your mind when a feeling asks to be understood instead of ignored. Let this linger like a familiar echo, the way certain truths return when the room gets quiet. There is no urgency here, only awareness waiting patiently to unfold. There are people who carry an invisible radar, finely tuned to the subtlest shape of human behavior. They don't just experience life, they search through it, scanning for patterns, inconsistencies, and hints that others may never notice. This kind of mind doesn't choose to analyze, it reacts to the world by trying to make sense of it before it can hurt or surprise them. It is a mind shaped by uncertainty, by moments where clarity was late and consequences came too fast. Maybe they learned early that feelings could shift without warning, that love could have conditions hidden in its silence, or that safety depended on paying attention. So they started watching, studying, interpreting not to judge others, but to protect themselves from being blindsided. Over time, analysis didn't just become a skill, it became a lens, a shield, and sometimes a quiet burden. Because when you see too deeply, you can never return to the simplicity of taking things at face value. The beginning is rarely noticeable when someone starts analyzing the world like this. It often happens in childhood, not as curiosity but as vigilance, a silent contract with the environment. If they pay attention, maybe things will stay predictable. They learned that understanding people made the world less frightening, and that noticing what others missed helped them avoid pain. What began as observation became a form of emotional mathematics, a constant calculation of motives, intentions, and risks. The child who once just wanted to feel wanted began to decipher every gesture, every shift of tone, looking for reassurance that didn't have to be asked for. When affection was inconsistent, they became interpreters of uncertainty. When love was unpredictable, they became detectives of behavior. And when emotions around them were unstable, they learned to anticipate instead of simply exist. This vigilance grows quietly, shaping the mind into a scanner of hidden truths. With time, the body reacts before thought even takes form, analyzing like breathing, involuntary and automatic. The nervous system learns to brace itself, reading the emotional temperature in a room before a single word is spoken. They become experts at detecting disappointment before it arrives, irritation before it spills, rejection before it becomes real. To others, this looks like overthinking, but to them, it is protection learned from experience. Each detail is a signpost guiding them towards safety. Each silence holds a clue about what might come next. And the brain, trained by uncertainty, keeps searching for meaning because it still fears the cost of missing something important. Psychology shows that analysis is often the mind's way of restoring control when life has once felt unpredictable. The brain constantly seeks patterns as a way to feel safe, especially when emotions have been confusing or responses from loved ones were inconsistent. When affection was unstable, the mind learned to predict people instead of trust them. When conflict arrived without warning, it became safer to foresee danger than to relax in peace. So the analytical mind becomes a sentry at the door of relationships, scanning for risk even in moments meant to feel warm. It listens for what is not said, noticing emotional drafts the way a seasoned sailor feels changes in the wind. It tries to protect connection by understanding it too deeply. It tries to protect the heart by never letting it be surprised again. But a mind that analyzes everything can become both shield and prison. It becomes difficult to be present when awareness keeps searching for cracks. It becomes exhausting to care when affection is measured rather than felt. The person who reads between the lines becomes so good at detecting danger that even kindness is questioned for hidden motives. Love begins to feel like a riddle instead of rest. Trust becomes something fragile, too delicate to rely on without proof. And intimacy transforms into an exercise in decoding another person instead of leaning into them. Even joy can feel suspicious when the mind wonders how long it will last. There is conflict inside such minds because a part of them longs to relax while another part remains on guard. They want simplicity, but they cannot stop searching for meaning. They want connection, but they fear what happens when they stop analyzing. This resistance is not stubbornness, but protection formed from emotional memory. The nervous system holds on to vigilance the way a drowning person clings to anything that floats. Even when the water is calm, the body remembers the storm. So the mind continues to analyze, not to judge, but to survive the echoes of what once felt unsafe. Overanalyzing is not about thinking too much. It is about feeling too much and not knowing where to place what is felt. It is about trying to make emotions predictable by turning them into puzzles with solutions. It is about fearing that what is misunderstood might become painful later. The mind begins to believe that clarity equals safety and uncertainty equals danger. Yet life is full of ambiguity, and emotions are inherently unpredictable. So the analytical mind wrestles with a world that cannot always be decoded, and this friction becomes its greatest internal battle. The heart wants to trust, but the mind wants to verify. The soul wants to feel, but the brain wants evidence. Inside this struggle lives a quiet longing, the desire to simply be without interpretation, to experience a moment without needing to understand it, to love without fear of hidden intentions, to speak without scanning for reactions, to listen without decoding every pause. There is a yearning to live life as it is, not as a mystery that must be solved before it is lived. Yet the mind cannot easily let go of the habits that once kept it safe. It is difficult to relax when vigilance feels like survival. It is difficult to surrender when control feels like protection. The body does not forget what it had to do to feel secure. Eventually, some people begin to notice the cost of constant analysis. They realize that understanding everything does not always make life easier. They see that knowing every possible meaning of someone's words does not necessarily protect them from pain. They observe that certainty does not guarantee safety. And in this realization, something shifts. Awareness begins to expand not through control, but through acceptance. The mind grows tired, not weak, but ready for a new way of existing. A way that does not require solving every experience to feel secure. A way that does not demand perfection from emotions to trust them. A way that does not insist on meaning before feeling. This turning point is not dramatic, but deeply internal. It happens when a person notices the exhaustion hidden beneath their constant vigilance, when they recognize that overthinking is not clarity, but a desperate attempt to avoid uncertainty. When they understand that protecting themselves has slowly become another form of suffering. And in this recognition, they begin to loosen their grip. Not immediately, but gently, the way a hand relaxes after holding something too tight for too long. Awareness becomes less about control and more about witnessing. Insight becomes less about predicting and more about understanding. Analysis shifts from fear to curiosity. And curiosity, unlike vigilance, does not drain the soul. The analytical mind can learn to ask softer questions. It can learn to observe without dissecting. It can learn to see meaning without needing to own it. It can learn that not every feeling needs a definition, and not every silence needs interpretation. It begins to realize that connection grows not by solving people, but by experiencing them. That safety comes not from prediction, but from self-trust. That clarity is not found in decoding others, but in knowing one's own emotional truth. The mind slowly discovers that meaning can unfold naturally without force, that life can be lived instead of examined, that emotions can be felt without being measured. Healing for the analytical mind is not about stopping thought. It is about making space for uncertainty without fear. It is about acknowledging the part of the self that learned to analyze to survive. It is about offering compassion to the younger version of the mind who believed understanding everything was the only path to safety. Healing emerges from honoring that instinct and gently guiding it toward rest, not by silencing it, but by allowing it to soften, not by eliminating analysis, but by expanding experience beyond it. The brain does not need to stop watching for meaning. It needs to feel safe enough to stop guarding against pain. Over time, the mind learns that presence is not the absence of awareness, but the acceptance of what arises. It learns that connection is not earned through caution, but through authenticity. It learns that love becomes truest, not when it is perfectly understood, but when it is allowed to be imperfect. The analytical mind can still notice details, still understand deeply, still sense the subtle tone beneath words. But now that awareness becomes a gift, not a shield, insight becomes empathy instead of anticipation. Understanding becomes connection instead of control. The mind remains wise, but no longer burdened by its own vigilance. In this gentle evolution, the person discovers something unexpected. The world begins to feel kinder when it does not have to be solved. Moments become fuller when they are lived instead of interpreted. People become more real when they are experienced instead of decoded. Emotions become more humane when they are felt instead of controlled. And life itself, unpredictable and ambiguous, becomes less threatening when awareness is no longer a defense against it. The analytical mind does not disappear. It simply learns to coexist with vulnerability. It learns to think without fear, to see without suspicion, to feel without terror. At the end of this quiet journey, the analytical soul finds a new form of safety. Not in certainty, but in trust. Not in prediction, but in presence. Not in decoding others, but in understanding themselves. The mind becomes a companion instead of a guard. Insight becomes intuition instead of caution. Awareness becomes wisdom instead of anxiety. And the world, still filled with layers and meanings, no longer feels like a threat to navigate, but a story to experience. Life is still complex, still unpredictable, still rich with hidden depths, but it no longer needs to be controlled to be lived. If something in these words stirred a recognition inside you, let it sit with you quietly. Share it with someone who might also live inside the maze of their mind. Carry this reflection gently, the way one holds something fragile yet important. Let it remind you that depth is not a weakness, and clarity is not a burden. And when your thoughts begin to analyze again, let them do so with kindness rather than fear. Let them notice life, not dissect it. Let them understand, not protect. And allow yourself, even briefly, to simply be.